The first cries were never recorded, but they echoed all the same. Thin, desperate sounds swallowed by the heat of the Congo morning. In the villages, women learned to give birth quietly, not out of modesty, but fear. A crying child could travel farther than a prayer, and ears were always listening. Boots, ledgers, men who smiled with authority and spoke of futures that did not include mothers. The Belgians came with paper and promises. They said blood could be corrected. They said identity was something that could be rewritten if done early enough. In the shadow of churches and administrative posts, African women carried children who would be taken before they could walk, sometimes before they could be named. Love, it turned out, had no legal standing. At night, the women counted breaths instead of stars. Some pressed their palms against their bellies and begged the unborn to forget them, believing forgetting might hurt less than remembering. Others memorized every movement, every kick, as if memory itself could act as a shield. It never did. The knock always came politely. Civilization preferred manners. The children were lifted gently, like property that might break. A final kiss was often allowed, supervised, timed. Then the distance began, not miles but erasure. New names replaced old ones. Skin became a problem to solve. Mothers became footnotes, if they were mentioned at all. What was taken was not only children, but lineage, language, and the right to mourn openly. Years later, some of those children would feel a strange ache when hearing drums they could not place, or wake from dreams filled with faces they had never seen. The past clawed at them from inside, demanding recognition. And beneath layers of silence, beneath carefully archived lies, the truth waited. Patient. Damning and impossible to bury forever. She understood something was wrong long before anyone said it aloud. The change did not arrive with violence or shouting, but with glances that lingered too long and conversations that stopped when she entered the room. When the village women noticed her growing belly, their congratulations were muted, their smiles thin and cautious. This was not the first time such a pregnancy had appeared, and experience had taught them that joy invited grief. The men who passed through the region, uniformed, perfumed with authority, left more than footprints behind. They left consequences that did not belong to the women who bore them. At first, she told herself the child was hers simply because it lived inside her. She felt its movements at night, gentle reminders of life, insisting on existence despite the world it was entering. But whispers began to circulate, carried by missionaries and clerks who spoke softly of arrangements and futures. They used words like responsibility and opportunity, as though motherhood were a clerical error that needed correcting. She noticed how they counted months, how their eyes measured her body not with desire but ownership. That was when the realization settled in, heavy and irreversible. The child growing inside her was already spoken for. Not by love, not by family, but by a system that believed blood could be reassigned. The colonizers did not see a mother and child, they saw a problem that needed organization. Mixed blood children, they claimed, belonged neither here nor there, and therefore must be taken somewhere else. Somewhere cleaner, somewhere controlled. The woman learned this not through an announcement, but through certainty, the kind that enters the bones and refuses to leave. Fear altered the rhythm of her days. Each kick of the unborn child brought both comfort and terror, a reminder of what she would soon lose. She began to avoid the mission paths, to keep her eyes lowered. But there was no hiding from a fate written in ink and policy. The authorities believed they were acting with kindness. They said the children would be educated, protected, given a chance at a better life. What they did not say was that this chance required severance, required forgetting, required a mother to become invisible. By the time she accepted the truth, it was too late to run and too dangerous to resist. Her body had become a passage, her womb a temporary holding place. The child did not belong to the future she imagined, nor to the land that knew her name. It belonged to a distant idea of order, to a belief that love could be overridden by law, and that loss, when repeated often enough, could become normal. And in that quiet understanding she carried the remainder of her pregnancy, knowing that the child she had not yet met was already being taken from her and was nothing. She could commemorate. It was the only thing they'd remember, every sensation, because the only thing they had not yet learned how to compass. They did not arrive as thieves, at least not in appearance. They came dressed in white collars and pressed uniforms, carrying crosses, registers, and official seals that clicked shut with finality. Their language was gentle, rehearsed, designed to calm rather than confront. They spoke of salvation and structure, of rescuing children from confusion, of guiding young lives toward clarity and purpose. In their telling, the villages were places of disorder, and the children born there were at risk, simply by remaining close to their mothers. It was an argument shaped to sound merciful, and many wanted to believe it because believing hurt less than fighting. The removals began slowly, almost politely. A visit to the mission. A request for signatures from women who could not read the words placed before them. A reassurance that the separation would be temporary, that visits might be allowed, that the child would return educated and improved. Some mothers resisted, clinging to infants, while men explained procedures as if emotion were irrelevant. Others froze, paralyzed by the weight of authority and the threat of punishment that hovered just beneath every smile. Resistance was noted, compliance was rewarded with praise. They called it protection. They called it education. They never called it theft. The children were taken in daylight, often after prayer, so the act appeared righteous. Mothers were instructed not to cry too loudly, not to cause distress, not to interfere with what was being done for the greater good. The language of civilization wrapped itself around cruelty until the two became indistinguishable. Each removal followed the same script, refined through repetition. Names were recorded, then altered. Histories were simplified. Bloodlines were declared problematic. And as the wagons and boats carried the children away, the villages were left quieter, heavier, filled with women who learned that love had no defense against paperwork, and that the greatest violence did not always arrive with force, but with certainty, routine, and men who believed so completely and virginally in their own righteousness that they never once questioned the silence they left behind. She stood at the edge of the mission courtyard, as if her body no longer belonged to her, watching the final transformation take place in plain sight. The child she had carried, named in whispers and lullabies, was positioned before a table where papers lay neatly stacked. Ink waited patiently, as permanent as the decision already made. The boy did not cry. He had learned, quickly, that stillness pleased the adults. His eyes searched for her once, briefly, before being guided to face forward, toward men who spoke a language that pressed down on him like a weight he could not yet name. A priest dipped his pen and wrote a new name, one that sounded sharp and foreign, a name that did not know the soil where the child had been born. The old name was not crossed out or corrected. It was simply omitted, as though it had never existed. The mother felt something tear inside her, that no one else could see. This was not the moment of separation she had feared most. That had already happened. This was worse. This was replacement. They baptized him quickly, efficiently. Water poured over his head while words of blessing erased what they called uncertainty. The ceremony was meant to purify, but to her it felt like burial performed in reverse. Her child stood breathing, blinking alive, yet everything that tied him to her was being lowered into an invisible grave. The men smiled afterward, satisfied, congratulating one another on a task completed. They spoke of responsibility fulfilled, of futures secured. No one looked at the woman long enough to see what was being destroyed. When she stepped forward instinctively, a hand stopped her, gentle but firm. Touch was no longer permitted. She was informed that the child would be confused if she lingered. That emotional attachment would hinder his development. They used the word attachment as though it were a flaw, something that could be corrected through distance. She was told to be proud, to understand that sacrifice was sometimes required for progress. The sentence was delivered kindly, like advice passed between equals, even as it erased her entirely. The child was led away to join others like him, children suspended between worlds, trained to forget one before they could fully enter the other. From that moment on, records would describe him as an orphan, or as abandoned, or as rescued. None would mention the woman standing alone in the courtyard, hands clenched at her sides to keep from reaching out. History would note the date, the location, the successful integration into colonial care. It would not record the sound of a mother breathing through grief so intense it threatened to tear her lungs apart. In the days that followed, her existence became inconvenient. She was discouraged from asking questions. Each inquiry was met with confusion or irritation, as if the matter were already settled, and her refusal to move on was a personal failing. When she asked to see him, she was told he was adjusting. When she asked when she might visit, she was told it would interfere. When she asked if he remembered her, the question itself was treated as evidence of why the separation had been necessary. At night, she replayed his face as it had looked just before he turned away. She feared that memory would fade, that her mind would betray her the way the system already had. She repeated his original name silently, like a prayer no one else could hear, afraid that if she stopped, it would vanish completely. Around her, other women carried the same invisible wounds, recognizing one another through shared silence. Their children were alive, yet spoken of in the past tense, as if death would have been easier to explain. Years passed, and the child grew under strict rules that reshaped him carefully. He was taught to lower his voice, to straighten his posture, to distance himself from anything that reminded him of where he came from. His skin was treated as something unfortunate but manageable. His origins were framed as a mistake corrected through discipline. When fragments of memory surfaced, they were dismissed as imagination. When questions arose, they were answered with doctrine. He learned quickly that survival depended on obedience, and obedience required forgetting. The mother aged faster than time alone could explain. Her body continued living, working, existing, but something essential had been removed. She was no longer recognized as a parent by any authority that mattered. If she spoke his name aloud, it meant nothing to anyone else. If she pointed to the place he had slept, no one saw significance there. The world had accepted the lie so completely that truth sounded unreasonable by comparison. What haunted her most was not only the loss, but the precision with which it had been executed. There had been no chaos, no panic, no visible cruelty. Everything had been done cleanly, legally, politely. The system had functioned exactly as designed, and that design had required her erasure. She understood then that this was not an accident or a misunderstanding, but a deliberate act repeated countless times, refined through practice, protected by faith in law and certainty, leaving behind living ghosts who were expected to accept that their children had been taken not by force, but by righteousness, and that understanding settled into her like a permanent ache as she realized the world would remember the process as benevolent, while she would remember it as the day was erased. While still breathing as the children grew into adults, the past did not disappear, as they had been promised it would. It surfaced in quiet, unsettling ways that could not be disciplined out of them. A melody heard in passing would tighten something deep in the chest. A certain rhythm of speech, a familiar cadence, would feel intimate without explanation. Some woke from dreams filled with faces they could not name, women standing just beyond reach, mouths moving in languages they were never taught, but somehow understood. They learned early not to speak of these moments. The institutions had no patience for ghosts. They had been raised with carefully constructed stories about themselves. They were told they had been saved, corrected, elevated. Their files described them as fortunate, yet their bodies carried a different knowledge. Mirrors reflected skin that marked them as other, even in spaces that claimed to be home. They were reminded daily of what they were not, even as they were instructed to be grateful for what they had become. Gratitude, they discovered, was mandatory. Doubt was treated as betrayal. Many tried to erase the discomfort by excelling. They learned to obey rules perfectly, to speak without accents, to bury questions beneath achievement. Others failed quietly, internalizing shame they did not understand. A sense of displacement followed them everywhere, a feeling of standing slightly outside their own lives. They belonged neither to the land of their birth, nor fully to the world that had claimed them. The in-between became a permanent state. Some searched without knowing what they were looking for. They scanned faces in crowds, drawn inexplicably to women old enough to be their mothers. A smell of earth after rain or the crackle of firewood stirred emotions too large to explain. These moments arrived without warning and left behind a hollow ache. The past was not gone. It was waiting. When a few dared to ask questions, the answers were vague or dismissive. Records were missing. Names had been changed too many times. Origins were described as uncertain, inconvenient, or irrelevant. The truth had been buried beneath bureaucracy, making personal history feel like a forbidden curiosity rather than a right. Still, fragments survived in the body, in instinct, in the unshakable sense that something essential had been taken. What haunted them most was not only the absence of their mothers, but the realization that the separation had been intentional, designed to be irreversible. They began to understand that their confusion was not a personal failure, but the result of a system that demanded forgetting as proof of success, and that awareness, once formed, refused to be silenced, growing louder with age, shaping every relationship, every question. Every moment of recognition they were denied, and in that growing clarity, they carried the weight of two lives, the one they were given and the one that had been stolen from them. The truth did not arrive all at once, nor did it come with justice attached. It emerged slowly, reluctantly, pried loose by accident, persistence, and the inevitability of time. A clerk misfiled a document. A priest confessed to a detail he had never meant to share. An archive was opened to the public after decades of silence, and suddenly names appeared where there had once been blanks. Dates aligned too neatly to be coincidence. Patterns revealed themselves with a clarity that could no longer be denied. What had been dismissed as isolated cases resolved into a system, deliberate and vast. For those who had lived their lives inside the consequences, discovery felt both vindicating and unbearable. The stolen children, now adults or elders, encountered their own histories as if meeting strangers who shared their faces. Birth records surfaced with annotations that spoke casually of transfers and classifications. Letters written by administrators discussed children as logistical concerns, noting efficiency, cost, and outcomes. In margins, human lives were reduced to abbreviations. There was no language for remorse, only progress reports. The tone was calm, procedural, chilling in its certainty. Some of the men who had signed the papers were already dead by the time the evidence became visible. Others were old and frail, their memories selective, their apologies abstract. They spoke of context, of different times, of good intentions. They framed their actions as misguided kindness rather than calculated removal. Responsibility dissolved into committees and policies, into phrases like accepted practice and institutional norms. The machine that had caused the harm had no single face to confront, no body to imprison. Mothers who had survived long enough to witness the unveiling felt a different kind of pain take hold. Proof did not return their children. Documents did not restore years of absence. Some learned their children had lived nearby all along, raised under different names, separated by nothing but secrecy. Others discovered their sons and daughters had been sent far away, dispersed so thoroughly that reunion was impossible. The truth answered questions, but it also multiplied them, opening wounds that had never been allowed to heal properly. Public reaction was uneven. Some expressed shock, others disbelief. Many preferred distance, labeling the events as tragic but resolved, as history best left undisturbed. There were calls for reconciliation without accountability, for closure without consequence. The language softened again, attempting to dull the edges of what had been done. Yet, for those who had lived inside the erasure, softness felt like another lie. They had learned to recognize it. The stolen children began to speak, sometimes for the first time. Their testimonies varied in detail but echoed one another in shape and tone. Confusion, shame, longing, anger, and an absence that had no name until now. They described growing up under discipline that demanded gratitude while denying origin. They described loving adoptive structures while sensing something fundamental was missing. Their voices, once isolated, became a chorus that could not be ignored. The documents revealed intention where denial had once lived. Policies explicitly aimed at separation. Memoranda discussing the prevention of maternal influence. Religious justifications that framed motherhood as a threat to proper development. It became impossible to maintain the fiction that harm had been accidental. The system had known exactly what it was doing, and it had done it repeatedly, confidently, and with institutional blessing. Legal battles followed, slow and exhausting. Some governments acknowledged wrongdoing without accepting liability. Apologies were issued, carefully worded, often delayed. Compensation was debated, minimized, restricted. Recognition came in fragments, offered with reluctance rather than urgency. Even in truth, power remained unevenly distributed. Those harmed were expected to be patient, reasonable, restrained, as if their suffering required moderation to be credible. Yet something irreversible had shifted. The silence that had protected the system for generations was broken. Archives could no longer pretend neutrality. Churches confronted records that contradicted their self-image. Nations faced histories that did not align with their narratives of benevolence. The stolen children and their mothers were no longer ghosts. They were documented, named, and present. The truth did not heal everything. It did not erase trauma or restore lost years. But it changed the shape of the story. What had once been framed as fate or necessity was revealed as choice. What had been called care was exposed as control. And for those who had lived their lives doubting their own memories, the confirmation carried a fierce clarity. They had not imagined the loss. They had not misunderstood the pain. The harm was real, recorded, undeniable, and larger than any single life. And as the full weight of that knowledge settled into public consciousness, it became clear that the legacy of what had been done could not be closed with apologies or memorials, because the truth, once uncovered, refused to remain contained and continued to demand recognition, accountability, and remembrance long after the documents were read and the confessions spoken in the end. There was no single moment that marked closure, no ceremony capable of stitching together what had been deliberately torn apart. What came instead was persistence. Mothers who had been erased began speaking their children's names aloud, refusing to let them exist only in archives. Those who had been taken learned to say both names, the one assigned to them and the one stolen from them. Understanding that identity could hold more than one truth without breaking. Memory, once suppressed, became an act of resistance. Some reunions happened late, fragile, and overwhelming. A hand recognized another hand before the mind fully understood. Faces mirrored one another in ways that felt both miraculous and cruel. Years lost could not be reclaimed, but acknowledgement altered the weight of the loss. Where silence had once ruled, testimony took its place. Stories were passed down not as wounds to hide, but as warnings meant to endure. Others never found answers. Some mothers died without knowing where their children went. Some children died without learning who had first held them. Their absence remained, but it was no longer empty. It was named, recorded, and carried forward. What had been designed to vanish instead left a trace too deep to erase. The system that believed it could reorganize bloodlines underestimated the endurance of memory. Laws changed. Institutions issued apologies. Yet the most lasting reckoning occurred quietly, in homes and gatherings where truth was spoken without permission. The past no longer belonged solely to those who had written it. It belonged to those who had survived it. What remained was not forgiveness demanded too soon, nor reconciliation forced into neat language, but recognition. Hard, uncomfortable, and necessary. The story could no longer be told as one of misguided benevolence. It stood exposed as a deliberate theft of lives, carried out with confidence and defended by power. And so the ending was not resolution, but continuation. A refusal to forget. A commitment to remember every name, every mother, every child who had been taken and taught to disappear. History, once corrected, could not undo the harm, but it could no longer deny it. The voices that had been silenced now existed where they always should have. In the open, undeniable, shaping the future by insisting that what was done be seen, spoken, and carried forward so that no system would ever again be allowed to call erasure an act of care